President, thank you for this really important hearing and to all our witnesses today. You all have been very informative. I came earlier and got to hear some of your testimony. Sorry, we're running between hearings today. Let me just tell you a story. Yesterday, I was meeting with the U.S. ambassador to Italy, and I thought we'd be talking more about EU matters, but in fact, the topic shifted to China. And he told me that China is very involved in Italy and that Italy has recently chosen to sign over 20 separate BRI deals with China, totaling over $2.8 billion. I'm also hearing that Switzerland, again, I met with SWIFT's representative from the business community this week, talking about doing a trade agreement with Switzerland. I'm told that Switzerland is also working with China on projects in third countries. The comment was made earlier that our strategic partners aren't really part of Belt and Road, and our military partners aren't. Italy is certainly a strategic partner and a military partner. And so I just say this only to add to the litany of concerns that we should have about some of our even strongest allies in engaging on this. The Global Engagement Center, which is from legislation that we wrote in the Foreign Relations Committee, has given us some new information recently, and that is that China has been supplying video surveillance equipment to Belarus. They've been doing it since 2011. Back to Europe. In Europe alone, 17 countries have had Chinese telecommunications investments, 14 have had Chinese energy project investments, 20 for Chinese transportation and logistics investments. So I appreciate the comments that were made today about how we push back on that and how we reassert American investment and trying to help set standards. In particular, the DFC I support strongly, the BUILD Act. I was one of the original 6 co-sponsors of that bill. I believe it's an important counterpoint to what's going on around the world. And yet the BUILD Act is limited to lower and lower middle income countries, as you know. And that excludes some of those middle income countries in Southern and Eastern Europe we've been talking about today that are part of Belt and Road. So my question for you is, and maybe Ms. Bartholomew and Dr. Kleiman, you might respond, given that Southern and Eastern Europe have emerged as a strategic battleground between the United States and China, and I would also say vis-a-vis Russia, where there's significant influence, of course, do you believe the BUILD Act should be expanded to include some of those countries and some of those regions as well?
On that, I have to say I'm giving my personal opinion rather than anything to do with what the Commission has done. I think it would be a great idea to expand it. I hope that any expansion is not done at the expense of the low and middle income countries too, so that it is an expansion, not a substitution. A couple of other things you mentioned, if I may. One, the Russia-China. Of course, we actually held a hearing a month ago, 2 months ago, on Russia-China issues, and watching the growth of the Russia-China alliance is something that is of real concern. You mentioned surveillance in Belarus. Of course, there's surveillance equipment being sold all over the place. We even had Chinese surveillance equipment cameras. They are gone now, but outside some of our military bases and at the U.S. Embassy in Kabul. So there's supply chain issues that go along with that. But I think Russia, there was just this recent incident where a Russian Navy ship came very dangerously close to a U.S. Navy ship. Watching that Russia-China expanding relationship is going to be something very important that people focus on. One more thing on Europe, and two, actually. One is, I think it really—
Let me get on to my next question, so let me be sure and get an answer from you on this as well. Standards. And Dr. Kleiman, we can perhaps hear from you later on that first question. A key non-tariff barrier, of course, for our exporters is standards, and we talked about that some today. Mr. Scissors talked a little about the importance of standards. They make it easier for our businesses to do business overseas, particularly in unfamiliar export markets. Otherwise, regulations and so on make it very difficult for us to sell into some of those markets. The World Trade Organization's technical barriers to trade agreement in part encourages governments to adopt international standards for that reason. So there's international standard-setting bodies, and we support that. What I'm troubled by is seeing China take such a keen interest in the standard-setting process. Next-generation telecom technology like 5G is an instructive place to look. In 2018, China had 8 of the 39 available leadership positions in those standard-setting bodies, the most of any country, at the International Telecommunications Union 5G-related bodies. So that's the ITU, 5G-related bodies, 8 of the 39. The United States, by the way, had a single representative. At the International Standards Organization last year, China was in 3rd place among the representatives there. The United States was tied for 16th place with Finland. For the most participants, China also leads in standards essential patents, or SEPs, for 5G. These SEPs are patents that are for technology is essential for compliance with any given standard and can provide the owner global market share, licensing revenues, and advantage in tech development. Unfortunately, Chinese companies now own 36% of all 5G SEPs, with Huawei alone leading with over 1,500 of these patents. So the question for any one of you, given that the private sector technologies are so important and that the private sector manages U.S. membership in these standard-setting bodies, what should we be doing differently? Should the U.S. government get involved in this? We allow the private sector to take the lead, and yet we're not represented.
I'm happy to jump in on that
Yep.
as well as the other questions. So I think the U.S. government has to play a much more muscular and centralizing role that the private sector, I think, is looking for certainly more resources on the USG side to plug into these convenings where the Chinese are flooding the zone. And it's very hard for the U.S. government without the resources and kind of the top-down direction to compete on equal footing. Very quickly on your Europe questions, I mean, I do think you could consider, again, having kind of a strategic mandate for the DFC where in select cases they could plug into maybe middle-income countries in South and Eastern Europe. I think one area that would really move the needle in these countries is U.S. support for NGOs that are focused on Chinese influence. This can really expose a lot of China's activities and bring, especially in countries that are democratic, increase scrutiny. Lastly, in general, for South Europe and Eastern Europe, and more generally, I think Congress could play a role in encouraging a new definition of diplomacy, so the State Department focusing much more on commercial diplomacy rather than more of a kind of reporting function.
Well, thank you. My time's expired. I just appreciate the hearing, and I'm one of those who believes that we need a constructive relationship with China. It can be done. It should be done. But that's not the direction we're headed right now.